If you ever want to understand Tommy Lucchese, don't imagine a man stomping into rooms with a crown on his head. Imagine a man who could walk into a crowded New York street, look like just another tired businessman heading home, and still have the whole neighborhood, without realizing it, shift slightly to make space. Not because they feared him in a loud way, but because there was something in his calm that suggested he didn't waste time on noise. Tommy didn't chase attention. He collected leverage. And New York, restless, hungry, always in a hurry, was full of places where leverage could be found, if you knew how to look. He came from the old rhythm of immigrant life, where you learned early that money wasn't the only currency. Reputation mattered. Connections mattered. The ability to stay calm when other people got emotional mattered most of all. When you're young and poor, you either learn to talk your way out of trouble, work your way out of trouble, or quietly arrange life so trouble never sees you. Tommy learned the third option. He wasn't born into comfort. Like many men of his era, he started in the margins, small jobs, small hustles, small favors that grew into larger ones. He watched how men with power behaved. He noticed that the loud ones drew heat. The flashy ones created enemies. The ones who lasted were the ones who knew how to blend in, to look ordinary, to keep their pride in a pocket instead of wearing it on their sleeve. Tommy studied those men like a student studies a language, and then he took the parts he liked and sharpened them. New York in those days was a place of constant movement. Trucks, docks, markets, construction, unions, contracts, deliveries. The city wasn't just buildings, it was pipelines. Someone moved goods, someone moved money, someone moved permissions. If you could influence one pipeline, you could influence 100 smaller things that depended on it. Tommy understood pipelines. He understood that the man who controlled the door didn't need to shout. The door did the shouting for him, closed, open, closed again, depending on who asked and how. He began as someone useful, the kind of man who could help with problems. And help in New York is never just kindness. Help is an introduction to obligation. You help a man once and he remembers. You help him twice and he owes you. You help him at the right moment and he'll carry your name like a key. Tommy got very good at helping at the right moment. But he didn't help everyone. He had a careful filter. He preferred people who were steady, people who valued discretion, people who didn't talk too much. A loud person could ruin you. A steady person could make you money for decades. So Tommy built a circle the way you build a wall. Brick by brick, no gaps, no weak spots. He didn't need a crowd. He needed a few reliable people in the right places. And the right places were everywhere. Labor halls, trucking depots, construction sites, garment businesses, restaurants, small offices where paperwork looked boring but permissions were being sold quietly all day. Tommy's face didn't scream boss. That was part of his advantage. He could pass as a man you wouldn't look twice at. A slightly built figure, tidy clothes, eyes that seemed to be listening even when his mouth wasn't moving. He didn't waste words. He didn't waste emotion. He had the calm, clipped manner of someone who didn't need to prove he mattered. People sensed that. They didn't always know what they were sensing. They just felt it the way you feel an elevator slow down before the doors open. Something is about to happen, so you stand a little straighter. Tommy moved through the city like that, quietly shaping outcomes. In those early years, he learned what everyone learns sooner or later. New York rewards ambition, but it punishes impatience. A man who wants everything quickly usually ends up with nothing for long. Tommy wanted the long game. He wanted systems that kept paying, relationships that kept producing, arrangements that didn't break the first time pressure arrived. So he treated pressure as his teacher. When heat showed up, attention, rivalries, the city's endless appetite for stories, Tommy adjusted by getting quieter. He didn't react loudly. He didn't fight in public. He didn't throw tantrums. He tightened, reduced, reorganized. He made the same principle stronger in everything he did. Stay boring to strangers, stay decisive in private. That principle saved him more than once, because the city was full of men who fell in love with being seen. They bought fancy suits. They drove loud cars. They let their names bounce around like they were proud of the echo. Tommy watched those men like you watch fireworks. Bright, exciting, and guaranteed to burn out. Tommy didn't want to burn out. He wanted to run. As his influence grew, it didn't announce itself with parades. It spread like ink in water. Quiet, steady, hard to track until you noticed the whole glass had changed color. People began discovering that certain things were easier if you went through Tommy's world. Permits moved smoother. Jobs appeared. Problems vanished. Doors opened. And if you asked around who made that happen, you'd get a shrug, a vague answer, a name spoken softly, if it was spoken at all. That was Tommy's preference. He liked it when people felt his influence but couldn't point to it clearly. That made him safer, and safety was the real prize. Not money, not status, the ability to keep operating while the city swirled with noise. One night, in a modest room where coffee sat on the table and the tone stayed low, Tommy listened to a younger man talk too excitedly about a bold move. The young man spoke fast, eager to impress, eager to be seen. Tommy let him finish. Then Tommy said, in a calm voice that didn't rise above the room, "Why are you trying to be famous?" The young man blinked. "I'm not." Tommy lifted a hand slightly. Not threatening, just stopping the momentum. "That's what famous looks like," he said. "We don't do that. No lecture, no yelling, just a quiet correction." The room cooled. People nodded, relieved. The young man swallowed his pride and adjusted his tone. That was Tommy's power in a nutshell. He could reshape a room without breaking it. Because Tommy Lucchese wasn't building a moment. He was building a machine, a quiet, steady machine that could keep turning through decades of New York noise. And as the city outside kept racing, bright and hungry and restless, Tommy kept doing the opposite. He slowed down. He listened. He chose leverage over applause. And in that choice, his story began to deepen, toward bigger rooms, bigger responsibilities, and a kind of influence that would one day carry his name, even though he never liked names being carried at all. Tommy Lucchese didn't build power the way most people imagine power being built. He built it the way you build a hidden staircase in an old house. Quietly, board by board, making sure every step could hold weight without creaking loud enough for the neighbors to hear. By the time the city started to recognize his name, usually in whispers, usually with a cautious glance, Tommy had already learned the most important New York lesson there was. You don't win by being the most feared man in the room. You win by being the most useful. New York runs on movement. Goods moving, people moving, money moving, favors moving. And Tommy became a specialist in one thing, making movement easier for the right people and harder for the wrong ones. It wasn't magic. It was relationships, timing, and a sharp sense for where the city's invisible levers were hidden. Construction was one lever. If you control who gets labor, who gets supplies, who gets permits, and who gets no delays, you don't just control a project, you control a timeline. And in New York, timelines are everything. A building that goes up on time makes someone rich. A building that stalls makes someone desperate. Desperate people pay more, promise more, and make bigger mistakes. Tommy didn't like mistakes, so he made himself the kind of person who prevented them. He kept his style modest. Not shabby, Tommy liked looking put together but never flashy. He understood that flash creates a spotlight, and spotlights attract insects. People start circling. People start asking questions. People start wanting a piece. Tommy preferred to be the man people needed, not the man people watched. If you looked closely, you could see how he operated. He didn't bark orders across a room. He leaned in and spoke to one person at a time. He didn't punish loudly. He redirected quietly. He didn't argue emotionally. He asked calm questions until the other person realized they were the one being led. He had a way of making someone feel like they were reaching the smart conclusion on their own, when really Tommy had built the path with invisible fences. And because it felt like their conclusion, people defended it afterward. That's a powerful thing. If someone thinks an idea is theirs, they'll protect it like pride. Tommy used pride like a tool, but he never let his own pride run wild. That was another difference between him and the men who burned out. Tommy didn't need to win every conversation. He needed to win the week, the month, the decade. He could afford to let someone else feel important if it kept the system smooth. Smooth was his obsession. Smooth meant fewer arguments, fewer surprises, fewer opportunities for anyone to drag his name into the light. As his influence expanded, it didn't feel like expansion from the outside. It looked like normal business, paperwork, trucks, schedules, union chatter, contractor conversations. But inside those normal activities, Tommy was arranging a network. Not a dramatic empire with banners. Something quieter and more durable. A web of people who owed each other favors and understood that. Tommy was the one who kept the web from tangling. He paid attention to personalities like a doctor pays attention to symptoms. He liked calm men. He liked men who didn't drink too much. He liked men who went home at a reasonable hour. He did not like men who loved being recognized. Recognition was the first step toward showing off, and showing off was the first step toward trouble. One evening, a man tried to impress Tommy by bragging loudly about what he had pulled off. The room laughed, a little too eagerly, like they were hoping laughter would soften the risk of those words. Tommy didn't laugh. He simply looked at the man with a faint, patient expression, almost like a teacher watching a student guess the wrong answer confidently. Then Tommy said, very quietly, "Do you want to be admired, or do you want to be safe?" The man's smile froze. Tommy let the silence stretch just long enough to be uncomfortable. Then he added, "Because you usually don't get both. No threat, no lecture, just a truth spoken like a bedtime rule. Soft, firm, unavoidable." After that, the man talked less. Everyone else did too. That's how Tommy controlled rooms. He didn't need volume. He used tone. But Tommy's life wasn't only rooms and quiet warnings. He had a family side that mattered to him, and he guarded it carefully. He liked the respectability of family gatherings, the comfort of familiar food, the rhythm of regular life. Those weren't just decorations. They were part of his philosophy. If your own home is chaotic, you'll eventually bring that chaos into everything else. Tommy wanted his home to feel like a calm harbor. And yet, even harbors feel storms when the ocean gets rough. The city's undercurrents were changing. Different styles of power began rising, louder, brasher, more interested in public image. Tommy watched this trend with quiet concern. He didn't fear new personalities, but he feared what those personalities attracted. Attention. Because attention didn't just land on the loud men. It splashed outward onto everyone connected to them. Tommy responded the only way he knew how, by becoming even more careful. He tightened his circle. He made fewer appearances. He kept conversations shorter. And he emphasized something that sounded simple but carried a whole code. We keep it clean. Clean, in Tommy's language, didn't mean perfect. It meant control. It meant no unnecessary drama. It meant no foolish risks taken for ego. It meant the work of stability. Dull on the surface, relentless underneath. As the years moved forward, Tommy's name began to settle into a certain kind of permanence. People didn't say it casually. They said it like they were naming a direction on a map. If you wanted things to go smoothly in certain worlds, you needed to understand how Tommy's world worked. But Tommy still refused to be a character in anyone's story. He didn't want to be the headline. He wanted to be the hand that kept the headline from happening. And that made him quietly formidable, because a man who's built his whole life around avoiding trouble becomes very serious when trouble threatens his stability. Late one night, after a long day of calm conversations and careful adjustments, Tommy sat alone with coffee and listened to the city's distant hum. In the window, New York shimmered, restless, bright, hungry as ever. Tommy looked at it the way a mechanic looks at a powerful engine. Impressed, cautious, always thinking about what could break if the parts weren't kept in balance. Because Tommy Lucchese wasn't addicted to excitement. He was addicted to control. And in the next stretch of his story, control would demand bigger decisions, sharper alliances, and a kind of patience that only a few men could maintain when the whole city seemed to be speeding up. Tommy Lucchese had a quiet talent for predicting which way a room would lean before the room even knew it was leaning. He didn't do it by guessing. He did it by watching people the way a chess player watches hands hover over pieces. Small hesitations, tiny shifts in confidence, the quick glance toward whoever they truly feared upsetting. Tommy watched those details and then placed himself where the room would naturally tilt toward him without him needing to shove it. That skill became even more valuable as New York's hidden power circles grew more crowded. Crowded meant competitive. Competitive meant emotional. Emotional meant careless. Tommy didn't like careless. The city was changing again. New money, new personalities, more attention from outsiders, more curiosity from people who loved stories. Some men reacted by becoming louder, as if volume could protect them. Tommy reacted by becoming quieter, as if silence could. But silence alone wasn't enough. You also needed structure. You needed a system that didn't depend on one person's charisma or one person's temper. Tommy respected systems more than he respected individual egos, because systems lasted. Egos burned. So he began shaping his organization with a particular kind of discipline. He pushed influence into predictable channels: construction, unions, trucking, businesses that looked ordinary to anyone who didn't understand how the city really ran. He didn't want power that looked like power. He wanted power that looked like paperwork. Paperwork was safe. Paperwork didn't pose for photos. Paperwork didn't brag at bars. Paperwork just moved. And if you controlled the movement, you controlled the outcome. Tommy became a master of quiet delegation. He didn't surround himself with the loudest men. He surrounded himself with the most controllable ones. Men who liked routine. Men who didn't get bored and start inventing excitement. Men who understood that the best day was the day nobody noticed you had done anything at all. He rewarded discipline with trust. He punished recklessness with distance. Distance was Tommy's favorite punishment. He didn't always need to yell or embarrass someone. He could simply stop returning calls, stop offering opportunities, stop giving them access. In Tommy's world, access was everything. Losing access felt like being locked outside in the cold. People learned quickly. At the same time, Tommy had a businesslike side that almost seemed respectable if you didn't look too closely. He believed in agreements. He believed in predictability. He believed that if everyone knew the rules, fewer conflicts would erupt. That belief made him an effective organizer in a world where disorder could destroy everyone. But there was another layer. Tommy understood that rules only work if someone has the authority to enforce them. He didn't enforce them with drama. He enforced them with inevitability. If Tommy said something would be done a certain way, people tended to accept it not because he demanded it loudly, but because he had already built the conditions where resisting him felt like a waste of energy. It's hard to fight a current when you're tired. Tommy was the current. One night, a group of men met in a small, ordinary room. Nothing fancy, nothing theatrical. Coffee sat on the table. Ashtrays were present, though nobody seemed in a rush to fill them. The conversation was about a dispute, a conflict that could have grown into something noisy if handled badly. A younger man argued. Another younger man argued back. Voices rose slightly. The tension thickened. This was the kind of moment where a loud leader might slam a hand down and demand silence. Tommy didn't slam anything. He just waited. The arguing continued for another minute, then another. The men's voices rose, then began to falter as they realized Tommy wasn't reacting. Without reaction, arguments lose fuel. Eventually, one of them glanced at Tommy as if asking, "Are you going to do something?" Tommy met his eyes and said, softly, "Are you finished?" The words weren't angry. They were calm. But calm can be sharper than anger because calm doesn't leave room for negotiation. It leaves room only for obedience. The room went quiet. Tommy sipped his coffee as if nothing had happened, then asked a simple question, "What's the outcome we want?" That was his style. Strip away emotion, focus on outcome. The men answered more quietly now. They described what they wanted. Tommy listened. Then he said, "This is what we're going to do," and outlined a solution so practical and clean that it felt obvious in hindsight. Nobody cheered. Nobody clapped. They just nodded, relieved the heat had been removed. That relief was part of Tommy's power. People felt safer when he was steering because he kept problems from exploding into public disasters. But safety in Tommy's world always came with a cost. You had to follow the system. The next day, Tommy returned to looking like a modest businessman. If anyone outside the circle saw him walking down the street, They would see a man who appeared almost tired, almost ordinary, not a dramatic figure at all. That ordinariness was his armor. At home, he kept his family life tucked away from the city's loud currents. He wanted his house to be a place where the air didn't feel tense. He valued the respectability of family gatherings, the comfort of routine meals, the way normal life could remind you that not everything is strategy. But even in family settings, Tommy's mind never fully shut off. He noticed who said too much, who asked too many questions, who seemed tempted by glamour. He didn't like glamour. Glamour made men sloppy. He would gently steer conversations away from risky topics, like a man guiding a boat away from rocks. He wasn't a warm, chatty storyteller. He was a protector of boundaries. And in his mind, boundaries were love. As time passed, Tommy's influence grew into a name people used with a specific tone, not fearful exactly, but cautious, respectful. People understood that he valued order. He valued quiet. He valued results. If you cooperated, things could be smooth. If you created chaos, things could become difficult. And Tommy believed difficulty should always teach a lesson. But the city's world was never static. New pressures arrived. More attention. More ambitious men rising in different circles. The public fascination with organized crime increased, and with fascination came scrutiny. Scrutiny made everything riskier. Tommy responded by tightening again. Fewer meetings, more compartmentalization, more insistence on discipline. He began emphasizing a rule that sounded almost like a bedtime moral. Nothing good comes from showing off. He wasn't saying it as wisdom for children. He was saying it as survival for men who wanted to live long lives in a loud city. Late one evening, Tommy sat with a trusted associate and spoke in that calm, businesslike tone. "The city's getting noisier," the associate said. Tommy nodded once. "Then we get quieter," the associate sighed. "Some guys won't like that." Tommy's faint, controlled smile appeared. "They don't have to like it," he said. "They have to follow it." The room went quiet again. Not awkward, just heavy with understanding. Because Tommy Lucchese's power wasn't built on being liked. It was built on being obeyed. And as the city's noise kept rising outside, Tommy kept refining the same quiet approach that had carried him this far. Blend in, tighten the system, control the levers, avoid the spotlight. In the next part of the story, those choices, quiet as they were, will lead Tommy into bigger challenges, bigger alliances, and the kind of careful balancing act that only a few men could survive without slipping. Tommy Lucchese could tell when New York was entering a louder season, not by headlines, but by human behavior. People began speaking a little more recklessly. Younger men wanted faster results. Some started acting like the old rules were optional, like discipline was old-fashioned, like they could build a reputation the way you build a fire. Quick, bright, and visible from blocks away. Tommy watched that trend with quiet irritation. Not because he feared change. Tommy didn't fear change. He managed it. He was irritated because the city was already dangerous enough without men making themselves into billboards. A billboard invites attention. And attention invites pressure. Pressure invites mistakes. Tommy's whole life had been about reducing mistakes. So he did what he always did when the world got noisier. He tightened the system. He became more selective about who sat in rooms with him. He avoided gatherings where too many egos could bounce off each other like loose marbles. He insisted on shorter meetings, clearer objectives, fewer people in the know. Information, Tommy believed, should travel like money carefully through controlled channels, never spilled casually. At the same time, he deepened the organization's connection to the city's essential industries. Construction remained a key artery. Trucking and unions remained steady levers. Tommy didn't treat these areas like side hustles. He treated them like infrastructure. If you influence infrastructure, you influence everything that depends on it. And everything depended on it. A building project isn't just concrete and steel. It's delivery schedules, labor crews, subcontractors, inspections, supply chains. It's 1,000 small steps. And if any of those steps are slowed or smoothed, the entire project shifts. Tommy liked that kind of influence because it didn't look like power. It looked like business. That was always his preference. power disguised as routine. He also understood the importance of alliances, quiet agreements with other figures who valued stability. The city's hidden power structure was not a single throne. It was balance. Different groups, different interests, overlapping worlds. Tommy didn't seek unnecessary conflict. Conflict was expensive, but he also didn't allow disrespect. Disrespect was contagious, and contagion could spread faster than any rumor. So Tommy walked a careful line, calm on the surface, firm underneath. He made sure people understood the boundary without him needing to shout it. And when a boundary needed reinforcement, Tommy didn't handle it like a showman. He handled it like a businessman correcting a ledger. Quietly, precisely, without emotion. One case, during this era, became a sort of bedtime lesson inside the circle, told not as entertainment but as a warning. A younger man had started making noise, talking too much, acting too proud, hinting at connections he shouldn't have hinted at. He wasn't necessarily trying to betray anyone. He was trying to feel important. That, to Tommy, was nearly as dangerous as betrayal. Tommy didn't confront him in a dramatic way. He didn't humiliate him. He simply arranged a quiet conversation in a modest room with the kind of calm tone that made the other man's confidence shrink. Tommy listened to the young man talk for a while, letting him ramble into his own mistakes. Then Tommy leaned forward slightly and said, "Do you know why you're not safe right now?" The young man blinked, startled. "I'm safe," he insisted. Tommy's eyes stayed calm. "No," Tommy replied, still gentle. "You've made yourself visible." The young man tried to laugh it off. "So what? People respect me." Tommy shook his head once, a small motion. "Respect doesn't protect you," he said. "Discretion does." Then he added, softly but firmly, "If you want to last, stop trying to be recognized." That was Tommy's bedtime rule for his world. Don't become a character. Characters get written into stories. Stories attract attention. Attention invites consequences. The young man nodded, suddenly sober. And after that, he got quieter, not because he was inspired, but because he was frightened in the practical way Tommy intended. Tommy didn't need fear to be theatrical. He needed fear to be instructive. That's how Tommy maintained order. He trained people with consequences that didn't need to be loud. But the city's pressure wasn't only coming from reckless young men. It was coming from the outside world too. More curiosity, more scrutiny, more appetite for sensational stories. Newspapers liked naming bosses. Cameras liked catching faces. The public was beginning to treat the hidden world like entertainment. Tommy hated that. Entertainment encouraged showmanship. Showmanship ruined discipline. So he insisted on the opposite. He avoided unnecessary attention. He discouraged display. He pushed the idea that being boring was a badge of honor. "If they talk about you," he'd say in that calm, practical way, "you're doing it wrong." At home, Tommy guarded his privacy carefully. He wanted his family life to remain normal, or as normal as any life could be when the city always hummed in the background. He valued meals, routine, familiar faces. He understood that the fastest way to lose control outside was to let chaos seep inside. So he kept his home calm. But calm doesn't mean warmth. Tommy wasn't a man of big emotional displays. He didn't sit around telling jokes. He didn't gush affection. His love, when it showed up, came as protection and provision and boundaries. He believed that if the house was steady, the family was safer. That belief was sincere. And yet, in quiet moments, there were hints that the steadiness had a cost. Tommy spent so much of his life managing risk that it became difficult to relax fully, even at dinner. He listened too carefully. He watched people's expressions too closely. He treated every room like it might contain an unexpected problem. That level of vigilance is exhausting. But Tommy didn't complain. Complaining was noise, and Tommy didn't like noise. One late evening, Tommy sat with a trusted associate in a quiet place and spoke about the changing era. "The city's fascinated now," the associate said. "They want stories." Tommy's expression didn't change much. "Let them want," he replied. "They'll keep digging." Tommy nodded once. "Then we keep tightening." The associate hesitated. "Some guys are going to try to stand out." Tommy's gaze sharpened slightly. Then we remind them, he said softly. That standing out is how you get cut off. No drama, just certainty. Tommy's certainty had a steady gravity to it. People around him could feel that he wasn't bluffing. He wasn't a man who threatened for fun. He was a man who preferred prevention over reaction. And prevention for Tommy meant systems. More compartmentalization, more discipline, more control over who knew what, who spoke to whom, who moved where. Tommy treated the organization like a machine that needed constant maintenance. He didn't trust good intentions. He trusted procedures. As the years moved on, his approach made the operation smoother and more resilient, but it also made Tommy himself more isolated. The calmer the system became, the more Tommy seemed like a man living behind glass. Visible enough for people to sense him, unreachable enough that few truly knew him. And that, perhaps, was how he preferred it. Because Tommy Lucchese's greatest fear wasn't being disliked. It was being exposed. In the next part, the city's shifting pressures will force Tommy into even sharper decisions. Decisions about leadership, alliances, and how to keep a tight, quiet machine running in a world that keeps turning up the volume. Tommy Lucchese didn't trust eras. Eras had moods. They swung like doors in the wind, open to opportunity one year, slammed shut the next. Tommy trusted only what he could shape. Routines, relationships, and the quiet machinery of influence that kept paying even when the city changed its mind. But the longer he operated, the clearer it became that even the best machinery needed upgrades. New York was getting brighter. More cameras, more curiosity, more people who treated serious things like entertainment. The city was learning to stare. And when a city learns to stare, the men who survive are the men who know how to become wallpaper. Tommy did not become wallpaper by shrinking. He became wallpaper by blending his control into the city's natural patterns, so smoothly that resisting him felt like resisting gravity. During this period, Tommy began focusing less on moves and more on systems. He wanted fewer decisions made by impulse, fewer moments where someone's pride could create a scene. He wanted stability that didn't require him to show up everywhere personally. That meant building a structure strong enough to carry weight without constant supervision. It also meant choosing people. This was where Tommy's quiet intensity showed. He didn't choose men just because they were tough or confident. Toughness was common. Confidence was noisy. Tommy chose men with temperament. Patient, disciplined, capable of holding their tongue even when they were excited. Men who could live without applause. Because Tommy believed applause was how you got sloppy. He began rearranging responsibilities the way a careful homeowner rearranges furniture before winter, moving the fragile pieces away from drafts, placing heavy pieces where they could support the room. Some men were given more access because they had proven they could keep things calm. Other men were quietly moved away from sensitive areas because they had proven they liked being seen. Tommy didn't announce these changes. He simply made them happen, one small adjustment at a time, until the whole structure felt different and everyone accepted it as the new normal. That was his gift, turning decisions into how things have always been. Frankly, it made him frightening to some people because it meant he didn't need to threaten you loudly. If Tommy decided you were a problem, you didn't get an argument. You got distance. You got fewer calls. You got less opportunity. You got quietly lowered in importance until you either adapted or drifted. It was a cold kind of discipline, but it was effective. And effectiveness was Tommy's religion. One night, a businessman, someone respectable on paper, the kind who wore clean suits and talked about projects and timelines, sat with Tommy and tried to push for a deal too quickly. The businessman spoke fast, eager, promising big results, talking about how much money everyone could make if they just moved faster. Tommy listened politely, eyes calm, face unreadable. When the businessman finally paused to breathe, Tommy asked, almost casually, "Why are you in such a hurry?" The businessman laughed, nervous. "Because time is money." Tommy nodded once. "Time is risk," he corrected softly. The businessman frowned, confused. Tommy leaned back slightly and said, "When you move too fast, you trip. And when you trip, you don't just fall. You pull other people down with you." The businessman tried to smile like he understood, but he didn't. People who lived in daylight rarely understood the cost of attention. Tommy did. Tommy had spent his whole life paying that cost in advance so he wouldn't have to pay it later with interest. The businessman left that night slower than he arrived. That was Tommy's way. He didn't just negotiate deals. He trained people to respect his pace, because Tommy's pace was survival. At the same time, Tommy's health began to become part of the story. Not in a dramatic, public way, but in the quiet way health always creeps into a man's life when he's been carrying tension for too long. He tired more easily. He preferred shorter meetings. He relied more on trusted lieutenants to handle routine matters. This was not weakness. This was strategy. Tommy understood that showing fatigue could invite challenges, so he never showed it in a way outsiders could read. He kept his appearance tidy. He kept his tone steady. He still arrived when he needed to arrive, still spoke with the same calm authority, still made rooms lower their voices, without raising his own. But those closest to him noticed the shift. They noticed he asked more questions about continuity, about what would happen after. They noticed he grew even more impatient with showmanship. They noticed he emphasized discipline like a bedtime rule repeated to children who keep forgetting. Keep it quiet. He didn't say it with warmth. He said it with certainty, because quiet wasn't just a preference anymore. Quiet was protection, and protection mattered more than ego. Tommy began having more private conversations with the men he trusted most, conversations that were less about day-to-day operations and more about the future. Not in romantic terms, in practical ones. Who could be relied on? Who could keep the system stable if Tommy wasn't in the room? Who could maintain the same boring, disciplined rhythm without getting tempted by the spotlight? Tommy didn't want a successor who would become a character. He wanted a successor who would become a routine. In one of these private conversations, a trusted associate said, "People think you're the toughest one." Tommy's mouth twitched into something that wasn't quite a smile. "People think a lot of things," he said. The associate leaned in. "What do you think makes you, you?" Tommy paused for a moment. He didn't like philosophical questions, but he understood the point. He answered simply, "I don't get excited." The associate nodded, as if that explained everything. Tommy continued, voice soft. "Excitement makes men careless. Careless gets people noticed. Noticed gets people hurt." He didn't say that last word with any drama. It was just a fact, like saying winter gets cold. Then he added, "We stay boring." That phrase, "we stay boring," was Tommy's whole approach in 4 words. It also revealed something about him that few people considered. Tommy didn't enjoy this world the way thrill seekers imagine. He didn't love danger. He didn't chase adrenaline. He chased order. He chased control. He chased the calm feeling that comes from knowing the machine will keep turning tomorrow. As time went on, the city's noise didn't stop. The world kept getting more curious. New methods, new scrutiny, new ways for outsiders to shine light into corners. Tommy responded by making the corners smaller. He reduced exposure. He made fewer public appearances. He relied on layers, trusted people, limited information, tighter protocols. He treated every interaction like it might be overheard someday. He trained his circle to do the same. And slowly, a subtle shift happened. The organization became smoother and quieter, but Tommy himself became more isolated. When you build a system designed to protect you from attention, it can also protect you from closeness. It can turn your life into a series of controlled rooms where nobody speaks freely. Tommy accepted that trade. He had always accepted trades, and his biggest trade was this: he gave up warmth for stability. Late one night, he sat alone with coffee that had gone lukewarm and listened to the distant city hum. The skyline glittered like it always did, indifferent to any man's plans. Tommy stared at it for a long time, eyes steady, expression calm. He wasn't dreaming. He wasn't reminiscing. He was calculating. Because Tommy Lucchese, even as the years pressed on, remained what he had always been. A man who believed the future belonged to whoever could stay calm while everyone else got loud. And the louder the city became, the more Tommy prepared for the question he never liked to say out loud. What happens when the calm man isn't there to keep the room from boiling? By the time Tommy Lucchese started thinking seriously about after, he had already lived long enough to know a harsh truth most people avoid. The world doesn't pause to honor your habits. Keeps moving, keeps chewing, keeps making noise. And if you built your life on keeping noise down, the question becomes painfully simple. Who keeps the noise down when you're tired, when you're not in the room, when you can't correct a mistake with a quiet sentence and a steady stare? Tommy didn't talk about that question like a philosopher. He talked about it like a mechanic. He wanted to know which parts were strong, which parts were worn, and what would happen if a key piece stopped turning. He was older now. Not old in a helpless way, Tommy would have hated that word, but older in the way that makes you prefer shorter meetings and longer silences. He still had authority, still had that calm gravity, but his body had begun to ask for more rest than his mind wanted to give. So he began to shift weight off himself and onto the structure. He did it subtly, quietly, no announcement, no grand transition plan, just a gradual change in who handled what, who sat in which room, who spoke first, who carried messages. Tommy believed the best transition is the one nobody notices until it's already finished. That way there's less drama, less ambition flaring up, less scrambling for position. Tommy didn't mind ambition when it was disciplined, but he despised ambition that needed to be seen. He started watching his key people with even sharper attention. Not suspicion, Tommy didn't jump at shadows. He watched temperament. He watched patience. He watched who could take a small insult without turning it into a big problem. He watched who could let a petty disagreement die instead of feeding it. Because to Tommy, the future depended on one thing more than anything: restraint. In one quiet conversation, a trusted associate tried to reassure him. "You've got everything set," the man said. "Everybody respects you." Tommy's expression didn't change much. "Respect is easy," he replied. "Restraint is hard." The associate hesitated. "You think they'll lose it?" Tommy sipped his coffee, calm as ever. "Some will," he said. "Some always do." That was the trouble with systems built around discretion. When they work, they look boring. And when things look boring, younger men start thinking they can spice them up. They start thinking the old way is too slow, too cautious, too quiet. Tommy had no patience for spice. Spice brought smoke. Smoke brought eyes. So Tommy began repeating his core rule more often. Not loudly, not in speeches, just in little moments where it landed like a stone in the pocket. Don't make it a show. He was also more careful about his own appearances. He didn't vanish, that would look strange. He simply became predictable. Predictable is powerful. If you're always in the same general rhythm, people can't map your unusual movements because you don't have any. Tommy liked being unmappable. In those days, he spent more time at home, more time in rooms that smelled like familiar furniture and quiet dinners. Family life mattered to him, not because it softened him into a different man, but because it gave him something steady to hold. The outside world was always shifting. Home, when it behaved, could be a place where you didn't have to calculate every second. Yet even at home, the calculation never fully stopped. Tommy listened when relatives chatted, and he noticed who asked too many questions about business. He noticed who admired the wrong things: flash, fame, swagger. He would gently steer them away, the way you guide a child away from the edge of a staircase without making them feel scolded. A calm home was part of his discipline, but the city's discipline was harder to maintain as time moved on. Tommy could sense the changing atmosphere. More outsiders trying to understand how hidden things worked, more curiosity, more pressure. The world was getting more interested in stories, and stories loved names. Tommy hated names being repeated too loudly. He believed a name should be spoken only when necessary. Still, something interesting happened as he aged. His name became attached to a kind of brand of quiet control. People began using it not as a boast, but as a shorthand for a style: calm, businesslike, restrained. Even those who didn't know him well understood the vibe. This was a man who preferred smooth outcomes over dramatic moments. Tommy didn't enjoy being a symbol. Symbols attract attention. But he did understand that if a name must carry weight, it's better that it carry a message of restraint than a message of chaos. So he leaned into the message. Stay quiet, stay disciplined, stay boring. He held a few key conversations with people who would matter in the future. These weren't romantic handoffs. No tearful speeches. Just Tommy, in a modest room, talking like a man discussing inventory. Who's watching the jobs? He'd ask. Who's talking too much? He'd ask. Who's letting emotions drive decisions? He'd ask. When he didn't like an answer, he didn't explode. He simply adjusted. Move that man away from that responsibility. Put this calmer man here. Reduce exposure there. Tighten communication here. It was all maintenance. The kind of boring maintenance that keeps a machine from failing in public. One night, after a long day of these small adjustments, Tommy sat with someone he trusted deeply, someone who knew him well enough to speak honestly. You ever think, the man asked quietly, about how people will remember you? Tommy stared at his coffee for a moment, as if the question had a strange taste. I don't care, he said finally. The man raised an eyebrow. You don't. Tommy's voice stayed even. I care that it keeps running, he said. That's all. That answer sounded cold until you understood Tommy's worldview. To him, a system that runs smoothly means fewer crises, fewer spirals, fewer desperate mistakes. He believed chaos was what truly destroyed people. Control, even if it felt strict, was a kind of protection. He wasn't trying to be loved. He was trying to prevent collapse. As his health asked more from him, more rest, more quiet, Tommy's patience grew thinner for anything. That smelled like performance. If someone started telling a story too loudly, Tommy would cut it off with a look. If someone tried to impress the room, Tommy would let the silence punish them. If someone hinted at dangerous connections, Tommy would end the conversation the way you end a call with a spam number. Quickly, without emotion. He understood that the future would belong to whichever style won the next generation's hearts. Would it be restraint like his, or would it be swagger? Tommy wanted restraint to win. He wanted a world where nobody needed to stand on a table to feel powerful. But he also knew you can't control other people's appetites forever. Late one evening, he walked slowly through his home and paused near a window. Outside, the city glowed in the distance, restless as always. He watched it with the calm of a man who had outlasted many storms. He didn't look sentimental. He looked focused. Because even now, even with time pressing closer, Tommy Lucchese was thinking about balance. How easily it could tip, how quietly it could be restored, and how dangerous it would be if the next hands on the wheel didn't respect the same quiet rules. And in that thought was the soft cliffhanger of his life. The machine he built could keep turning, but only if the people who inherited it loved boring as much as he did. Tommy Lucchese didn't fear death the way dramatic men fear death. He feared disorder. Death was natural. Disorder was optional. And yet it always found its way in when people got emotional, ambitious, or careless. Tommy had spent decades training himself and everyone around him to avoid those three traps. In his mind, the goal was simple. Keep the machine steady, keep the city calm, keep the spotlight pointed somewhere else. But as his health declined, Tommy could feel something unsettling. The machine still ran, but it ran with more hands on it. And more hands meant more chances for mistakes. He began spending more time listening and less time traveling. Listening was safer. When you listen, you gather information without leaving footprints. Tommy's mind stayed sharp, and he used that sharpness like a needle, stitching loose threads before they became tears. He'd receive updates about projects, disputes, and personalities. He'd ask short questions that forced clarity. Who approved that? Why? Who else knows? Then he'd say, fix it. In a tone so calm it sounded like an instruction to tighten a bolt. No yelling, no threats, just the expectation that the world would be corrected back into order. Some people found that calm comforting. Others found it terrifying, because calm leaves nowhere to hide. When a man explodes, you can blame emotion. When a man stays calm, you understand he has already decided. Tommy's calm was decision. Still, beneath the control, there was a quiet tension in his circle. Everyone knew the truth even if nobody said it directly. Tommy wouldn't be around forever. That reality made certain people restless. Restless men do risky things. They test boundaries. They whisper alliances. They start imagining themselves as the next center of gravity. Tommy watched those restless movements like a doctor watching a fever. Not surprised, not panicked, just aware that the temperature was rising. He addressed it the only way he knew how, through structure. He tightened communication. He reduced the number of people involved in sensitive decisions. He made it clear, without speeches, that certain conversations were not allowed outside certain rooms. He didn't forbid things with loud rules. He made things socially dangerous. If you talked too much, you lost access. Access was the true currency. To keep the machine stable, Tommy also leaned on the calmer personalities. Men who didn't want to be celebrities. Men who treated power like a job rather than a thrill. Tommy knew the difference between a man who wants to run something and a man who wants to be seen running something. Tommy trusted the first type. He distrusted the second. One afternoon, a younger associate tried to test him. The man spoke in a tone that suggested he wanted more responsibility, more visibility, more recognition. He listed his contributions like he was presenting a resume. Tommy listened, expression neutral. When the man finished, Tommy asked, "Do you want to work, or do you want to be admired?" The young man tried to smile. "Both," he said. Tommy shook his head once, very slightly. "That's how people get careless," he replied. The young man's smile faded. Tommy didn't humiliate him. He didn't raise his voice. He simply ended the conversation with a gentle finality. "Keep doing what you're doing." Quietly. It wasn't permission. It was a boundary. And boundaries were Tommy's love language to his world. As time went on, Tommy's health demanded more stillness. He wasn't as present in public. He didn't move around the city as freely. He relied on routine and trusted people. He let the machine run while he sat closer to the center, listening for unusual vibrations. There's a particular loneliness to that role. People who sit at the center of a system often can't fully relax around anyone. Everyone wants something. Everyone has an angle, even if it's a small one. Tommy had lived with that reality for a long time, but in his later years it became sharper. When your world narrows, you notice what's missing. Warmth was missing. Not completely. Tommy had family. He had people around him. But real warmth, the kind where you can say what you feel without calculating consequences, was rare. Tommy had trained himself to avoid that kind of openness because openness can be exploited. The result was that even in quiet moments, he remained guarded. Sometimes, late at night, he would sit with coffee and listen to the city's distant hum. The city sounded like it always sounded. Restless, alive, indifferent. Tommy didn't romanticize it. He didn't hate it. He understood it. New York was a machine too, a louder machine, and Tommy's entire life had been about finding the levers inside it. During one of these late-night moments, a trusted associate sat with him. The man asked, carefully, "Are you worried about what happens after?" Tommy's eyes stayed on the coffee. He didn't answer immediately. Finally, he said, "I'm worried about people forgetting the rules." The associate nodded. "The rules will stay." Tommy looked up then, gaze calm but sharp. "Rules don't stay," he said. "People stay, or they don't." That was Tommy's realism. He didn't believe in abstract stability. He believed in disciplined behavior, and disciplined behavior required constant reinforcement. As his health continued to decline, Tommy became even more focused on one thing: leaving behind a structure that discouraged chaos. He couldn't control the future completely, Tommy knew that, but he could influence the incentives. He could make quietness rewarding. He could make recklessness costly. He could make the path of least resistance the path of restraint. That was his final project. While other men might have sought legacy, Tommy sought continuity. He didn't want his name carved into myth. He wanted the machine to keep running with fewer fires, fewer public storms, fewer moments that would attract attention. In a way, he was trying to protect people from the worst parts of their own nature: pride, impatience, the desire to be seen. And that's what made Tommy both impressive and chilling. He understood that the enemy wasn't always outside pressure. Often the enemy was inside the room, a restless mouth,
a hungry ego.
a man who needed applause. Tommy fought those enemies not with fists or shouting, but with the quiet weight of discipline. And as the years pressed on, the question wasn't whether Tommy's machine could keep turning without him. The question was whether the men left behind could resist the temptation to turn the machine into a stage. In Tommy Lucchese's world, the most dangerous sound wasn't a siren. It was a man's ego getting loud. And as Tommy grew weaker, he could hear more egos clearing their throats. Not always in obvious ways. Sometimes it was a joke that lingered too long. Sometimes it was a story told with a little too much sparkle. Sometimes it was a younger guy showing up dressed a little too sharp, acting like he belonged at the center of things. These were small signals, but Tommy had built his life on reading small signals the way sailors read waves. A big storm always announces itself first with small shifts. So Tommy did what he had always done when he sensed a storm. He reduced the number of open windows. He narrowed access further. He insisted sensitive matters be handled through fewer hands, fewer phones, fewer friendly check-ins. He preferred messages delivered in person and quietly. He preferred fewer names spoken aloud. He preferred the kind of routine that makes everything look boring from a distance. Boring was safe, but safety is never free. The more Tommy tightened, the more certain people felt squeezed. And squeezed people reveal who they truly are. Some became calmer, grateful for the structure. Others became restless, feeling like the system was holding them back from their moment. Tommy didn't care about moments. Moments were fireworks. He cared about decades. He had one particular meeting during this time, small, private, and quiet, where he let the room speak before he did. He was seated, looking slightly tired, but his eyes were sharp. He let a few men talk about opportunities, the way people talk when they want permission to move faster than is wise. One of them used the phrase new era. Tommy waited until the phrase stopped echoing, then asked calmly, "What's wrong with the old era?"
No sarcasm, no anger.
Just a question that forced everyone to think. A man tried to answer. "The city's changing." Tommy nodded once. "The city always changes," he said. "The rules don't." Someone else said, "People don't have patience like before." Tommy's gaze stayed steady. "Then they learn," he replied. The room went quiet, not because anyone was scared of a tantrum. Tommy didn't do tantrums. The quiet came because his calm carried finality. In that room, Tommy's voice was still the steering wheel. Even when his body was tired, his tone was not. After the meeting, a trusted associate walked with him a short distance, as if escorting him wasn't necessary but felt respectful. The associate said, softly, "They're hungry." Tommy didn't deny it. "Hunger makes men loud," he answered. "What do we do?" the associate asked. Tommy paused, like he was listening to something beneath the conversation. Then he said, "We keep feeding them the same meal." The associate blinked. "Meaning?" Tommy's expression barely shifted. "Work," he said. "Routine. Structure. No deserts. No deserts." Tommy's way of saying, no flashy rewards, no public victories, no ego treats. Because ego treats create addiction, and addiction creates noise. As weeks passed, Tommy became more still. He moved slower. He rested more. But he remained involved in the way a conductor remains involved even when he's not playing an instrument. He listened. He decided. He corrected. He kept the tempo. And he kept watching for the true danger. The moment when someone decided to be bold in public. Tommy hated public boldness. Not for moral reasons, he didn't frame things that way. He hated it because public boldness invites public reaction, and public reaction never stays contained. It spreads to everyone, even the careful ones. There was a small incident, small on the surface, that illustrated his fear. A younger associate, eager to look important, made a remark in the wrong place. Nothing explosive, nothing graphic, just a bragging hint that suggested connections he shouldn't have suggested. It was the kind of comment that would sound meaningless to most people, but meaningful to the wrong listener. Word reached Tommy quickly. The next day, The young associate was invited to sit with someone trusted, quietly, politely.
No yelling, no humiliation.
Just a calm conversation that ended with the associate returning to his life noticeably quieter. When someone asked later what happened, the answer was vague. Tommy talked to him. That was enough. Because Tommy talked to him was a sentence that carried the weight of a warning without any threat. It meant the system has eyes. The system has memory. The system is not a playground. At home, Tommy's family noticed his fatigue more now. They spoke softly around him, offered food, offered comfort. Tommy accepted kindness in his restrained way, nodding, a faint smile, gratitude that didn't overflow. He wasn't a sentimental man, but he valued loyalty, and family loyalty was the one kind of loyalty he liked without calculation. Still, even with family, he stayed guarded. He didn't explain his worries. He didn't confess his thoughts about the future. He treated those thoughts like dangerous objects best kept out of reach. But one evening, when the house was quiet and the light in the kitchen was low, someone close to him said gently, "You've been thinking a lot." Tommy looked at the table as if it were a map. "I always think," he replied. "Yes," the person said, "but now it feels heavier." Tommy paused. The pause was long enough to be honest. Finally, he said, "People forget what keeps them safe." That was all he offered. He didn't say, "I'm worried." He didn't say, "I'm scared." He didn't dramatize. But the truth sat in the room. The calm man was tired, and the world gets loud when the calm man isn't there to lower the volume. Over the next months, Tommy's presence became more symbolic, less physical. He was still respected, still the reference point. People still used his name carefully, but he wasn't everywhere. He couldn't be, and that created a new tension. The system depended on discipline, and discipline depended on enforcement. Tommy had enforced it with tone, timing, and control over access. Would others enforce it the same way? Would they value boring, or would they crave applause? Tommy understood that the future would be shaped not by the strongest man, but by the most patient one. Patience was the true power, because patience prevents mistakes. Patience allows you to wait out storms. Patience keeps you from grabbing attention like a child grabbing a shiny object. Tommy wanted his people to inherit patience. He wanted them to inherit restraint. And as he lay awake some nights, listening to the city's distant hum, he imagined the machine he built continuing without him. Smooth, quiet, disciplined. Then he imagined the other possibility. A world where someone gets hungry for fame, makes a show, and invites the spotlight back. Tommy's eyelids would lower, his breathing slow, and his mind would return to the same simple rule he'd lived by from the beginning. A rule that sounded almost gentle, almost like bedtime advice, until you understood what it protected. Stay boring. Stay quiet. Stay alive. Tommy Lucchese's story didn't end with a parade or a dramatic final scene. It ended the way he lived, quietly, carefully, with the city humming outside like it always did. As his health faded, he tightened what he could still control. Fewer conversations, fewer people in the room, fewer chances for anyone to turn discipline into a performance. He kept repeating the same lesson, sometimes with words, sometimes with a look, until it became the closest thing he had to a legacy. Stay boring, stay calm, don't invite the spotlight. When he was gone, the machine he built kept turning for a while because he had designed it that way. Steady, practical, built on routines instead of applause. People still spoke his name softly, not because he was flashy, but because he had been the kind of man who could cool a room without raising his voice. And that was the final bedtime truth of Tommy Lucchese. In a city that never stops making noise, the most powerful man isn't always the loudest one. Sometimes it's the man who keeps everything quiet enough to last.